Hey everybody, it's your old pal John. I hope you're all doing well. Trying to knock out two videos here that were sent to me. This one was Plan Red, Britain and America's planned wars on each other. Yes, this is true. I even did a video about it like years ago. It's probably still on this channel somewhere. Yeah, in the 1920s, if I remember correctly, both Great Britain and the U.S. went through a period of time where they both drew up plans to attack each other via Canada, I think. And it had to do with, go figure, something that we always go back and forth in the comments about in some of the older videos, is the funding the U.S. Gave to Britain and France, and they were concerned that in the 1920s there could be a default. That's how I remember it. And if there was a default, then they would attack and try to take Canada. The U.S. would, which is very weird. So let's get into this.
The United States and Great Britain were the closest of allies during most of the 20th century. They fought together in two world wars and acted as the cornerstones of the post-war NATO alliance.
Yep.
However, for a time in the 1920s and 30s, things were not so rosy.
Right.
For a time, the militaries of both nations even prepared for open conflict between them.
Yeah. There were even plans drawn up to attack
The impact
Japanese.
of the First World War had changed relations between Britain and America in some ways that were likely to increase tension between them. First, it left the UK owing a huge war debt to the United States,
Right.
$22 billion, at a time when their entire GDP was just $26 billion.
That's a tough one.
Secondly, it removed Germany as a global naval power, when its mighty battle fleet was interned at Scapa Flow and then broken up.
Right.
With the Germans out
The Germans, most of the fleet intentionally sunk itself.
of the picture, the United States became the world's second naval power behind Britain, which
Right.
potentially made her Britain's primary rival for control of the sea. This new
Isn't that weird how that happens? Like allies, all of a sudden, like you have two of the not roughly same size, but the two top navies. Then they become they sort of both have knives behind their back about it.
newfound naval strength was recognised in 1921 when the British agreed to parity with the Americans in capital ships at the Washington Naval Conference.
Right.
Unlike with Germany's naval challenge earlier in the century, the
So the Washington Naval Conference set a maximum amount of like battleships and like larger ships, I think, and smaller ships. Set like limits for every country. And one of the people that pulled out ended up pulling out were the Japanese because they felt it was unfair to proportionately set these limits on things. But you know, World War One was supposed to end all wars, so anyway.
British government had little desire for another costly naval arms race and was determined to see the United States as a partner, not an enemy.
Right.
When the Admiralty recommended in June 1919 that an officer be tasked with drawing up contingency plans for war with the US, the British cabinet refused. Prime Minister David Lloyd George was keen not to allow the Navy to use the newly powerful American fleet as justification to increase the size of its own. This
Okay.
decision irritated some within the Navy who thought that war was possible so long as America's commercial influence across the world continued to grow. Deputy Chief of the Naval Staff,
But fair
Vice
point.
Admiral Sir Osmond Brock, argued that because of Britain's track record of fighting those who threatened its commercial dominance, I am quite ready to allow that a war with the United States is very improbable, but that it is impossible I cannot allow. As for how such a war would happen, the concern from a British perspective was not that the US might simply wake up one day and declare war on Britain, but that the two nations might accidentally stumble into hostilities in a dispute over trade. For example, suppose that Britain was involved in a war against another nation, which the US traded with.
Right.
Under what Britain termed its belligerent rights, she would claim the ability to stop and search neutral merchant ships and seize any goods which it was believed was heading for the enemy country.
Believe it or not, this was the same reason that the War of 1812. So when the United States essentially got involved with, not involved with Napoleonic War, but became a sideshow towards it. This was the reason. It was, we call it impressment. the British would board American ships who were trading with Napoleon and I believe other countries like that, and they would actually impress, meaning take American sailors and put them on the ships. So that was a Great Britain thing. I hope I didn't just say England. But
during World War I, the exercise of these dubiously legal rights had irritated the USA considerably, and let's suppose that the same was true in this hypothetical war.
You know, it always happened. It never really sort of stopped. It's just that was the one war in the past that was fought over it, and it's interesting to see that maybe 100 plus years later, another war could have broken out for that same reason.
Only this time, the US, feeling confident with its navy at parity with the UK now, decides to escort its merchant ships to and from Britain's enemy and force its trade through.
Right.
This would give the British a huge problem, since cutting overseas trade to a hostile nation was extremely important to any war plan it drew up against any major power. If the US took action to undermine this, it's likely the Royal Navy would feel it had no option but to use force to protect its belligerent rights and thus slip into a war against the United States without really meaning to. This is the scenario which some in the Royal Navy foresaw. Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, told Winston Churchill in 1927, "If we are ever at war with America neutral and the American fleet sets out in convoys to force her trade, I pray that the government of the day will have the nerve to allow the British fleet to deal with the situation." American officers too were not blind to the possibility of a war with Britain.
And by the way, makes sense because you're already the victors of a war, of a major world war. So yeah, I see that point of view.
Even though they too had no desire for one to take place. One difference between the two nations' attitudes though is that the Americans thought it feasible, perhaps even natural, that Britain would declare war on them to protect her commercial position at the top of the tree.
Right.
As far as the Americans were concerned, argues Christopher Bell, Britain had always used its navy in a ruthless and calculated manner to protect and further its trade, and would continue to do so.
That's like a very American thing to say. Britain has always used its navy as a ruthless and calculated manner to protect and further its trade. And I don't think it's always been ruthless. Certainly there are some times where that has happened, but there are some times when they showed great restraint. So it's a very American statement to make.
As the British had attacked Copenhagen in 1807 to protect its trade through the Baltic, it seemed possible that they would do just the same to the US if they got the chance. So, with this in mind, in 1930 the United States Army and Navy devised War Plan Red, a comprehensive plan for a war with Britain and her dominions.
You know what it kind of feels like? It feels like old thinking in a more modern time. It just doesn't work that well. It's sort of like, our Civil War we used in the United States, we used Napoleonic tactics with modern technology at that time, the result was mass casualties. Because the war changed. It was getting into trench warfare.
The central focus for Plan Red was Canada, which it was thought would be firmly on Britain's side in any conflict. The worst case scenario for the US was considered to be a rapid and massive build-up of troops and ships in Canada through an invasion south. It was forecast that within 40 days of war being declared, Britain could have a fleet of 14 battleships and 5 aircraft carriers established at Halifax. It projected 345,000 troops could be mustered in Canada within 6 months, with reinforcements from across the Empire eventually taking the total up to 2.5 million men. Clearly,
yeah, I don't know. I think at that point, I don't know if Britain would stay and hold to fight that, but all right, I see where they're thinking. You do worst case scenario thinking.
To allow such a force to assemble would be incredibly dangerous, and so Plan Red recommended attacks into Canada to capture major cities and especially the port of Halifax, to deny the British a suitable naval and supply base on the Atlantic North American coast.
Yeah,
other attacks would capture Quebec, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg and Vancouver.
Just for the note, and yes, I'm going to use the pointer here, in this area right here, basically kind of like from here over to Quebec or to Winnipeg and then south, that's like 50% of the Canadian population right there. So if you strike in that area, that makes sense. You take care of most of the Canadian population.
aiming to overrun Canada in a very short space of time. Opposing the US drive north would be the small Canadian army of 95,000 men. The US thought these troops would attempt to hold Halifax and a line around Montreal and Quebec, but the only serious Canadian plan produced called for a somewhat different course of action. Designed by Lieutenant Colonel James Buster Brown in 1921, Defence Scheme No. 1 advocated a series of rapid attacks into the United States by so-called flying columns.
Right.
Under Brown's plan, these units would advance to the US on the day war broke out, go as far as they could and then retreat, destroying infrastructure as they went.
Right, trying to
The
buy
purpose of this
time.
was to buy time until the British could come across the Atlantic to Canada's aid.
Very
However,
good
from what we
strategy.
can tell, the British had no intention of deploying a major force to Canada. In the view of the Admiralty, it would put Britain into a fight where all advantages of time, distance and supply were on the side of the USA. For all intents and purposes, the Royal Navy wrote off the vast majority of Canada as having fallen and began its planning from that assumption. However, it is worth mentioning here that the British never produced a joined-up inter-service war plan in the way the US did, so it's hard to say with real certainty what the British would or would not have done.
Right.
Perhaps troops would have been sent across the Atlantic, but even if so, they would have likely found ports to be in American hands. This was because Defence Plan No. 1 put very little emphasis on holding the Atlantic ports, even as it relied upon British troops entering through those very same ports to aid the Canadian Army.
Well, and you have to think that logistically speaking, that's got to be hard to keep an army of. Even in the, let's say 2.5 is an over embellishment, or is an embellishment. But if you say like a 1 million man army, to keep them fed and logistics going, you do need to have your naval routes secured. So it can be a tough one. I could see why Britain would kind of be really hesitant to do that.
Unsurprisingly, almost nobody within the Canadian military thought this was a sensible idea, and Defence Plan No. 1 was very quickly dismissed. Brown's successor as Director of Military Operations and Intelligence, Andrew McNaughton, even ordered all copies of it to be burnt.
Oh, I didn't know that.
On land then, it seems pretty likely that the US would have been able to overrun Canada, save perhaps for a few key bases on the east coast. How a war would progress from there is unclear, and seems not to have been very clear in the minds of those planning for it.
Probably would end there.
Plan Red essentially hinged on the idea that in the long run America would be able to mobilise its superior resources, and with the occupation of Canada eventually forced the British to make a favourable peace deal.
Yeah, okay.
The British planned to use its navy to just make life unpleasant for the Americans. A strong fleet will be sent across the Atlantic to be based at Bermuda, with smaller fleets in the Caribbean and at Halifax.
Sure.
From this position they would try to keep the American fleet bottled up, unable to attack British shipping while enabling British cruiser forces to hurt the US's overseas trade. Neither side was keen to seek a major fleet engagement, so the strategy for both would be to try and make the war as unpleasant as possible for the other side, and essentially outlast them. The reality would be that without Canada as an active theatre, neither nation had a very effective way to deal a decisive blow to the other.
That's what I was thinking, is if Canada falls, it becomes naval warfare.
The only way this might have changed, and this is what the Royal Navy feared more than anything, was if the US was able to gain a naval base in Western Europe and move its battle fleet across the Atlantic first. With a US fleet in place in Europe, the Royal Navy would find itself pinned down, with its trade routes open to being decimated by roving US cruisers. A serious blow to Britain's overseas trade would always be decisive, which is why the Royal Navy was always so anxious to maintain its superiority on the oceans during the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right.
Ultimately, we will of course never know the outcome of a war between the United States and British Empire, as thankfully policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic knew just what a self-destructive folly it would have been. Instead, War Plan Red would be filed away, and a decade later Britain and America would find themselves allied once again, joining forces to help rid the world of fascism.
Yeah, so that's pretty much the idea. I think, it's just interesting that these were drawn up, but I should say this too, that America after World War I was sort of in its adolescent phase in terms of military power. It kind of wasn't until World War II that it became a larger military power. There's really no want of this. But to be fair, there were many plans that were drawn up, and one was Plan Orange, and there were like different variations of this, like if Japan were to attack, where would they attack, and how would the U.S. respond? Because this was, as opposed to necessarily Great Britain. Now, the Japanese were something that, they were just an ocean away. I don't want to say just, it's a big ocean, but so there were responses, and the Japanese, of course, were a very militaristic society, or becoming, and yes, were a very militaristic society at the time. So, drawing up these plans, it's not the worst idea. It actually seems sort of normal, but you hear like the attack of Canada, or like two of our great relationships, Britain and the United States with Canada. It just seems unheard of when you hear it, but at the time, you think that, like, even during our Civil War, which was like 70 years before this, when they're talking about, the United States and Britain were pretty close to going to war a number of different times. And so it's not unheard of. All right, let me know what you all think. I'll talk to you soon.